You know that feeling when the price of something you buy regularly just changes? Or you hear about these big global trade disputes and you kind of think, okay, but how does this actually affect me here in the U.S.?
Right, that link between the headlines, the big policy talk, and your everyday life.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about.
Exactly. And that connection is precisely what we're going to unpack today. We're doing a deep dive into U.S. trade policy, really focusing in on trade wars, tariffs, trying to understand the impacts on American consumers, on businesses.
A huge topic, constantly evolving. You've got the stated goals from the government, then you have the real world headaches for companies trying to manage these super complex supply chains.
And the dynamics between major countries like the U.S. and China, it all feeds into this picture that's, well, both high-level strategy and also really personal for you, the listener.
Yeah.
And just to be clear up front, for this deep dive, everything we discuss, all our insights, are drawn strictly from a specific set of sources you've provided. We've got the official government take-in, the USTR's 2025 trade policy agenda, and 2024 annual report.
That gives us the administration's own view on its goals, its actions.
Then we have an article from Knowledge at Wharton that gives us more of an academic perspective, specifically looking at how tariffs are hitting global supply chains.
And finally, there's a backgrounder from the Council on Foreign Relations that helps us understand the really intricate U.S.-China trade relationship, at least as they describe it in their analysis.
So our mission today is simple, really. We're going deep into these specific documents. We want to pull out the most important bits of information, connect the dots between these different viewpoints,
and explain it all clearly, sticking only to what these sources tell us, so you get a really focused understanding of this material.
Think of it as your shortcut to getting up to speed, based only on these inputs. No outside opinions, just what's in these papers. Okay, let's get started. Let's unpack the official view first from that USTR report.
Okay, so the main document here is the USTR's 2025 Trade Policy Agenda and 2024 Annual Report. USTR, that's the U.S. Trade Representative, they have to submit this to Congress every year. It's required by law.
Okay.
And it basically does two things. Lays out the president's trade agenda for the year ahead and reports on how U.S. trade agreements have been working over the past year. It's really the administration putting its cards on the table saying, here's our strategy, here's what we've been doing.
So this isn't someone analyzing the policy from the outside. This is the government presenting its own case. And reading that forward, wow, there's a very distinct philosophy laid out. What's the core idea they're pushing?
Yeah, the forward really sets the stage. It frames the whole approach around building what they call a production economy. The language is quite strong, emphasizing that the American way of life is all about creating, inventing, building, growing, producing things here.
Right.
And it directly links things like a strong middle class with good wages and even national defense to having that domestic work, domestic investment, innovation, productivity.
And the report argues this is needed because of, well, what it sees as negative trends before. It uses some stats to back that up, right?
It does. It throws out some pretty stark numbers to argue for this shift. It says between 1993 and 2016, the U.S. lost 5 million manufacturing jobs, dropped from 17 million down to 12 million.
Wow.
And in a similar time frame, 1997 to 2016, it claims over 100,000 factories closed. Plus, it mentions the U.S. goods trade deficit hitting over $1 trillion before 2017.
Those are some big numbers they use to frame the problem they say they're solving. So how do tariffs fit into this production economy idea, according to the report?
Well, the report kind of paints the policies of previous administrations as the result of this withering, decades-long assault by globalist elites, arguing those policies only helped a few people and hurt workers.
Okay.
And in contrast, tariffs aren't presented as some unfortunate side effect. They're framed as a legitimate tool of public policy.
A legitimate tool. Interesting phrasing. A tool to do what, specifically? What's the stated goal?
The report is explicit. The goal is using tools like tariffs to get the leverage needed to, and I quote, rebalance our trading relations and to reshore production.
Reshore production. Bring it back home.
Exactly. It ties directly back to that production economy idea. The stated aims are raising wages, strengthening national defense, all by getting manufacturing and other production back into the U.S.
Okay, so that's the philosophy. The report then points to things it says were accomplished during the first term using this approach, presenting them as proof it works. What does it highlight there?
The big one they detail is renegotiating NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, into the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement.
Right, USMCA.
The report calls the USMCA provisions historic. claiming they're specifically designed to encourage reshoring, especially in the auto sector, which the report says was decimated under NAFTA.
Okay.
It also boasts about the USMCA having the strongest labor and environment provisions ever, plus getting new market access for U.S. farmers and setting new rules for digital trade.
So they're holding up the USMCA as Exhibit A, basically saying, see, this assertive approach using leverage gets results. Does the report try to link this policy to broader economic numbers like income?
Oh, absolutely. It makes a very direct connection. It contrasts the real median household income growth rate between two periods. From 2000 to 2016, it says growth was only 0.3% per year.
Pretty slow.
Very slow. Then it looks at 2016 to 2019. This is before the COVID pandemic hit, and reports an average annual growth rate of 3.4%.
Okay, 0.3% versus 3.4% annually. That's more than 10 times faster in the later period, according to their figures. How does the report explain that jump?
It draws a straight line. It says, quote, "By putting America first on trade, President Trump restarted our production economy in a single term, something prior presidents failed to do for a generation." So in the report's telling that faster income growth is a direct result of the America First trade policy.
It doesn't mention other potential factors in that period.
Not in this section. The report's narrative here focuses squarely on crediting the trade policy for that acceleration. It's a pretty bold claim they're making with those numbers.
Okay. So, beyond the big picture philosophy and these claimed successes, the USTR report also digs into the mechanics how they actually enforce trade rules and go after practices they consider unfair. What are the main tools they talk about?
A really key one they discuss is Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. This basically gives the USTR the authority to investigate and take action if a foreign government's actions, policies, or practices are seen as unreasonable or discriminatory, and if they burden or restrict U.S. commerce.
So it's a way for the U.S. to act on its own outside of, say, the WTO.
Exactly. It's a powerful unilateral tool.
And the report talks a lot about using Section 301, especially regarding China. What specific areas does it focus on there?
China is definitely a major focus. The report mentions things like China targeting the semiconductor industry. But it goes into quite a bit of detail on one specific Section 301 investigation, China's alleged targeting of the maritime, logistics, and shipbuilding sectors, aiming for global dominance, the report says.
Okay, maritime, logistics, shipbuilding. What did the USTR find in that investigation, according to the report?
The report states the investigation concluded that for almost 30 years, China has been systematically targeting these sectors using top-down industrial planning. It describes this as part of China's state-led non-market system, things like 5-year plans, specific industry plans with targets for production, domestic content, market share.
And using non-market policies to hit those targets.
Right. The report claims this approach has undercut competition and taken market share with dramatic effect.
What kind of effect? Does it give numbers?
It does, and they're pretty dramatic. It says China's share of the global shipbuilding market jumped from less than 5% in 1999 to over 50% by 2023.
Wow, from 5 to over 50%.
Yeah. And it also states China now produces 95% of shipping containers and 86% of the world's intermodal chassis, those frames that containers sit on.
That's incredible market control described there. So based on all that, what did USTR decide under Section 301?
The conclusion, according to the report, was that China's policies and practices in these sectors are unreasonable and burdens or restricts U.S. commerce.
Why unreasonable or burdensome?
The reasoning given is that these actions push out foreign firms, deny opportunities to market-based companies, reduce global competition, and create economic security risks for the U.S. because of this dependence on China. Undermining supply chain resilience is the phrase used.
Okay. And what action did that lead to?
The report says that based on these findings, proposed Section 301 actions were initiated. At the time the report was written, USTR was apparently reviewing public comments before finalizing those actions.
The report also revisits those long-running concerns about China, technology transfer, and intellectual property, right?
It does. It stresses the concern that China still uses things like foreign ownership limits, like forcing joint ventures and administrative hurdles to basically pressure U.S. companies into transferring their technology.
Still an issue, they say.
Yes, and it also alleges China's tech regulations force U.S. companies into licensing deals that aren't market-based and unfairly benefit Chinese companies. Plus, the report claims China actively directs and helps Chinese firms acquire U.S. companies and assets specifically to get their hands on technology and IP.
Hasn't the U.S. taken action on this before? Did that resolve it, according to the report?
No, the report is very clear on this. It says that while previous Section 301 actions might have reduced U.S. exposure somewhat, China has not eliminated many of its technology transfer-related acts, policies, and practices, and these continue to burden U.S. commerce.
So the problem persists.
Worse, the report claims that instead of changing, China has persisted, and in some cases become more aggressive, even mentioning cyber intrusions and cyber theft. So yeah, these issues are still front and center in the USTR's view, as presented here.
And Section 301 isn't just about China, though it seems like a major focus. What other examples does the report give?
Briefly, yeah. It mentions Section 301 actions related to digital services taxes, DSTs, imposed by countries like France. It also references the big EU large civil aircraft dispute over Airbus subsidies.
Right, the Boeing-Airbus fight.
That one. And also mentions the EU hormones dispute involving certain meat exports and investigations into Vietnam regarding illegal timber and currency valuation. So it's used in various contexts.
Okay. Now, the report also brings up Section 201 actions. How is that different from Section 301?
Good question. Section 201 is what's called a safeguard measure. Section 301 is about unfair foreign practices. Section 201 is different. It lets the U.S. temporarily restrict imports if a surge in imports of a specific product is seriously hurting or threatening to hurt a domestic industry. Importantly, this can happen even if the imports aren't technically unfair.
So just a damaging surge is enough. What examples does the report give?
It mentions applying Section 201 safeguards to crystalline silicon photovoltaic cells, basically, solar panels, and also to fine denier polyester staple fiber.
Got it. Besides these unilateral tools, the report also talks about using formal dispute settlement, like at the WTO or under free trade agreements.
Right, that's another key part of their enforcement strategy described in the report. It lists several cases the U.S. has brought against other countries. And again, China features prominently. The report highlights the China Electronic Payment Services, or EPS, dispute at the WTO.
EPS, what was that about? Credit card processing.
Essentially, yes. The systems that handle electronic payments like credit and debit cards. The U.S. argued China had measures in place that blocked or discriminated against foreign EPS suppliers, breaking its WTO promises.
And how did that turn out, according to the report?
The report says the U.S. largely won. The WTO panel agreed with the U.S. on key points, like defining EPS as a single service. It also found that China's requirement for cards issued in China to have the UnionPay logo violated WTO rules about treating foreign companies the same as domestic ones.
Okay, so a win for the U.S. there on digital payments.
Yeah.
What other big case against China does the report mention?
Another one they detail is the China tariff rate quotas TRQs case. This was about imports of wheat, rice, and corn.
TRQs, how do those work again?
They allow a certain amount of imports in at a low tariff rate. Anything above that quota gets hit with a much higher tariff. The U.S. complained about how China was administering these quotas.
What was the problem?
The U.S. argued China's system was opaque, unpredictable, unfair, and basically stopped the quotas from ever being fully used by exporters. The report says the WTO panel sided with the U.S. on several issues here too, finding problems with China's eligibility criteria, allocation methods, reallocation rules, public comment process, and rules about using the imported grain, all inconsistent with WTO obligations, the panel found.
So the USTR report uses these WTO cases, EPS, TRQs, as examples of successfully challenging China's practices through established channels. Does it also acknowledge that the U.S. gets challenged too?
Yes, it does mention that. It notes that other countries also bring disputes against the U.S. through the WTO or FTAs. It brings up that EU large civil aircraft case again, noting that there were findings against the U.S. regarding certain subsidies, just as there were findings against the EU regarding Airbus. So it's not just a one-way street.
Right. Okay, moving beyond just enforcement, the USTR report talks about using trade policy to actively support certain U.S. economic sectors. Which ones do they emphasize?
Manufacturing get a lot of attention. The report notes manufacturing added $2.5 trillion to U.S. GDP and made up nearly 80% of U.S. goods exports in 2024.
Big numbers.
Huge. And the report says the administration has a relentless focus on an industrial strategy to revitalize the U.S. manufacturing base. USTR's job, it says, is to make sure trade policy supports U.S. domestic industrial policy.
And this connects back to the tariffs.
Exactly. This is where it loops back to using tools like those Section 301 duties on China in strategic manufacturing areas, trying to level the playing field, create opportunities for U.S. manufacturers.
What about services? That's a big part of the U.S. economy, too.
Very big part. The report points out the U.S. is the world's largest trader of services, both exporting and importing. U.S. services exports hit a record $1.1 trillion in 2024, almost a third of total U.S. exports.
And even more if you count services embedded in goods.
Right. On a value-added basis, services are about half the value of U.S. exports. So USTR's work here, as described, is about fighting barriers, increasing market access. The report mentions focusing on digital finance and digital payments, especially for small businesses, and participating in WTO talks on things like services domestic regulation and e-commerce.
And what about those small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs? How does the report address them?
They're described as playing a fundamental role as economic engines. The USMCA is used again as an example here, highlighting its dedicated SME chapter.
What does that chapter do?
It set up a committee with the U.S., Mexico, and Canada to cooperate and share info for SMEs. The report mentions a dialogue held in Montreal in 2024 discussing things like getting SMEs into global value chains, customs processes, IP rights, financing, e-commerce, practical stuff.
Okay.
It also mentions a similar chapter focusing on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, MSMEs, in the U.S.-Kenya trade partnership talks, including helping Kenya set up small business development centers like the ones in the U.S.
So supporting smaller businesses is woven into these trade efforts. The report also mentions transparency and getting public input, right? How does that work?
Yes, it outlines their system for getting advice. There's a multi-level structure of trade advisory committees. You've got the top-level president's advisory committee, then policy committees for big areas like agriculture, labor, environment, state and local governments.
And more specific ones, too.
Yeah, technical or sectoral committees for specific industries.
Who sits on these committees, according to the report?
The report says they represent a really broad cross-section. Labor unions, industry groups, farmers, small businesses, service providers, consumer advocates, state and local officials, environmental groups. Their job is to advise USTR on negotiating goals and how trade policies might impact their areas. The report also notes regular consultations with Congress as part of this process.
Okay, that gives us a pretty thorough picture of the U.S. government's stance, strategy, and actions as laid out in the USTR report. Philosophy, goals, tools, enforcement, sector support, public input. Now, let's look at the actual trade numbers for 2024 that are in the report's annexes. What do they show?
Right. Annex I has the key data. Globally, the report notes estimates of about 3.2% GDP growth and 3.1% trade growth for 2024. It points out this was slower growth than previous years, and it happened alongside global consumer prices cooling off a bit.
And for the U.S. specifically, total trade.
Total U.S. trade exports plus imports of goods and services went up 5.4% in 2024, reaching $7.3 trillion. That was a rebound after a dip in 2023. Trade made up about 25% of U.S. GDP.
How did exports stack up against imports?
U.S. exports grew 3.9% to $3.2 trillion. A record high in dollar terms, but the report calls it a marked slowdown compared to the really fast growth in 2021 and 2022. Imports grew faster, up 6.6% to $4.1 trillion.
Okay, so imports grew faster than exports overall. What about goods versus services? Can you break that down?
Yeah, the details are interesting. Goods exports grew at only 1.9%, reaching $2.1 trillion. But services exports grew much faster, up 7.9% to a record $1.1 trillion.
Strong growth in services exports and imports.
Similar pattern, but less pronounced. Goods imports were up 6.0% to $3.3 trillion. Services imports also grew strongly, up 8.9% to $0.8 trillion. So services trade both ways grew faster in percentage terms than goods trade in 2024, based on this data.
That difference naturally leads to the trade balance, the deficit, which is often a big focus of policy talk. What happened to the overall U.S. trade deficit in 2024, according to the report?
It increased significantly. The overall deficit in goods and services jumped 17.0%. That's an increase of $133.5 billion, bringing the total deficit to $918.4 billion.
Wow, a 17% jump in the deficit. Was that driven more by the goods side or the services side?
The report is very clear on this. The deficit in goods alone grew even faster in percentage terms, up 14.0%, which was a $148.5 billion increase, hitting $1.2 trillion.
$1.2 trillion goods deficit.
Meanwhile, the U.S. surplus in services did grow, but only by 5.4%, or $14.9 billion, reaching $293.3 billion. The report explicitly states the overall deficit increase was primarily driven by the larger increase in the goods deficit.
That's a really important detail from their own numbers. the goods deficit widening significantly, swamping the smaller increase in the services surplus. Based just on this data in the report, what does that pattern tell you about U.S. trade right now?
Well, looking only at these USTR figures, it really underscores the continued strength of the U.S. in exporting services, finance, IP, business services, things like that. We have a big surplus there, and growth was still pretty good in 2024. But it also shows, pretty starkly, that despite all the policy talk about boosting domestic manufacturing found earlier in the report, the U.S. is still importing vastly more goods than it exports, and that gap actually got wider in 2024, according to these numbers. It paints that picture of the U.S. as a huge consumer of foreign goods while being a powerhouse in selling services globally.
Interesting dynamic. The report also lists the top export markets for U.S. goods. Who are the top 5 in 2024, and did exports to them go up or down?
Top 5 goods export markets listed are Canada, Mexico, China, Japan, and the EU. Looking at the year-over-year changes shown in the table, exports went up to Mexico by 3.5%, Japan by 5.0%, and the EU by 0.7%. But exports went down to Canada by 1.4%, and notably down to China by 2.9%.
Okay, so exports to China actually decreased in 2024, according to the USTR's data, while they increased to places like Mexico and Japan. Given the whole policy discussion in the report about confronting China and reshoring, what might that decrease suggest, staying within the report's context?
Well, reading that data point, alongside the report's narrative about challenging China's practices, you could interpret that 2.9% decrease in goods exports to China in a couple of ways, based on the report. It could suggest the overall goods-trade relationship is shrinking, maybe because of lower demand in China, maybe as a result of the trade friction. From the USTR's perspective as presented, maybe they'd see it as part of a strategic shift, a reduction in dependence. The report doesn't explicitly connect those dots in the data annex itself, but it's a notable figure presented alongside that policy narrative.
It definitely stands out. Does the report give a quick look at which sector saw big changes in exports or imports?
Yeah, the tables give some highlights. For instance, both exports and imports of capital goods hit record highs in 2024. Suggests a lot of trade in machinery, equipment. Exports of foods, feeds, and beverages were up, but exports of autos and auto parts were down. On the import side, capital goods and consumer goods saw big increases. It gives you a feel for which parts of the economy are driving the trade flows.
Okay, so we've really dug into the official U.S. government perspective from that USTR report about philosophy, the goals, the tools, the actions, the numbers. That's one crucial piece. Now, let's shift gears. Let's look at how these policies are actually impacting the real world, starting with supply chains, drawing from that Knowledge at Wharton article.
Right. The Wharton article gives us an outside look, specifically zeroing in on how U.S. tariffs affect global supply chains. And it makes a really important distinction right off the bat between the supply chain stress from COVID versus the stress from tariffs.
How does it differentiate them? What's the key difference according to the article?
The article quotes a professor, Senthil Varagavan, who says that with COVID, even though things were incredibly stressed, the feeling was mostly that it was temporary. Eventually things would snap back to normal pre-pandemic ways.
Okay.
But tariffs, he says, are different. They're described as a fundamental change, something that's upending supply chains, maybe even resetting them in a more permanent way, not just a blip.
And is this fundamental change seen as good or bad for supply chains in this article?
Pretty clearly bad. The article states tariffs are seen as generally bad for global supply chains. The logic presented is that supply chains thrive on collaboration, on mutual benefit across borders. Tariffs just gum up the works, add friction, add costs, and undermine that collaboration.
But what specific negative effects does the article point to?
It talks about severe damage, especially for supply chains that deal in low-margin goods. Think cheap industrial parts, apparel. When margins are already razor-thin, adding tariffs is incredibly painful, very hard to absorb.
Right.
And it notes that even in more complex chains, like autos or other industrial goods, tariffs on cheap little components drive up the cost of those components, which then gets passed along, making the final product more expensive.
So it ripples through the whole chain. How are companies reacting to this uncertainty and these costs, according to the Wharton article?
It describes a few different reactions. Some companies apparently tried to rush goods into the U.S. before tariff deadlines hit, hoping they could sell that inventory at the old prices.
Boop the clock.
Yeah. Relocating manufacturing is also mentioned as something companies are considering. It uses Apple as an example, saying they could maybe move some iPhone production. But the article stresses that's a really complex, slow process. It has to be gradual and patient.
And are there more immediate impacts on operations?
Yes, and this is a critical point in the article. It says that, so the article uses that to show how tariffs can just directly snarl up those complex flows, causing shutdowns elsewhere that then hit the U.S. market almost instantly.
It also mentioned companies being stuck in an inventory dilemma. What's that about?
Yeah, it describes companies as being in a tight spot with inventory. Holding a lot of inventory might seem like a buffer against future tariff hikes or disruptions, but holding inventory costs money, storage, financing. And with all the uncertainty plus the risk demand could drop, there's a real danger the value of that inventory could just plummet while it sits there.
Okay, so holding too much is risky. What about holding too little?
That's risky too, according to the article. You might face much higher costs later if tariffs go up. Or worse, you might just run out and not be able to supply your customers at all. So it's this tough balancing act with big potential downsides, whichever way you lean.
That really shows how policy uncertainty translates into concrete business problems. How does the Wharton article say these supply chain issues affect regular consumers?
It points to pretty immediate effects. The example it uses is the resale value of used cars. It links changes in used car values directly to the limited inventories of new cars caused by these disruptions.
So the upstream problems quickly hit downstream prices.
Even for used goods.
Exactly. It suggests the supply chain issues don't just stay within industry, they directly impact availability and what you end up paying.
Okay, now let's bring in that third source, the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR backgrounder. It also touches on consumer impacts, but gives a wider view, especially on the U.S.-China trade dynamic.
Right. The CFR article takes a longer historical look at the U.S.-China trade relationship, outlining both benefits and costs over the years. For U.S. consumers, it mentions the historical benefit of lower prices on Chinese imports.
Cheaper goods.
Yeah. It even cites a study estimating that trade with China boosted the average U.S. household's annual purchasing power by about $1,500 between 2000 and 2007. It also notes U.S. companies that got into the Chinese market benefited from higher profits.
So definite upsides mentioned, lower prices for consumers, higher profits for some companies, but the CFR piece also talks about the downsides.
Yeah, it does. It explicitly acknowledges this trade relationship comes with costs, notably the loss of American jobs. It attributes those losses to a mix of things. Import competition from China, yes, but also rising automation in the U.S. and companies choosing to move manufacturing overseas. So the CFR analysis paints this picture of significant gains for consumers in some firms, but also real pain for certain segments of the U.S. workforce.
The CFR article really zooms in on that U.S.-China relationship itself. How does it characterize it?
It stresses just how huge and intertwined these two economies are, the world's two largest. Together, the article says they accounted for 43% of global GDP and nearly half of global manufacturing output in 2023. It points to the massive trade growth since China joined the WTO in 2001 and how important they are to each other as markets. China is our third biggest export market. We're their biggest. It even mentions China holding around $760 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds, making them our second largest foreign creditor after Japan.
Deeply connected. Yet, the article confirms that the tensions since 2018 really do constitute a trade war.
Yes, the CFR article doesn't mince words. It says, many experts say escalations have not subsided since 2018, and flat out uses the term trade war. It notes Chinese officials have apparently said there are no winners in this, and points out that President Biden largely continued many of Trump's policies on China trade.
What reasons does the CFR article give for why the U.S. took these actions, the tariffs and restrictions against China?
According to the CFR source, the justifications cited by the Trump administration and mostly continued by Biden boil down to punishing China for alleged unfair trade practices.
Like what specifically?
The list includes Chinese government subsidies that hurt U.S. workers, the long-running issue of IP theft, and pressure on U.S. companies to hand over technology.
Right. The tech transfer issue again.
Exactly. The CFR article mentions that 2017 estimate putting the annual cost of Chinese IP theft between $225 and $600 billion. It explains that China's state-led system often requires firms to transfer tech to even operate there. And it also mentions China's alleged role in fentanyl trafficking as another justification cited.
And how did China react to these U.S. measures, according to the CFR?
The article says China retaliated with its own tariffs on U.S. goods, noting some of their retaliatory tariffs hit as high as 125%. It also mentions China using export controls on critical minerals, stuff needed for batteries, electronics, military gear.
So, tit for tat. Tariffs met with tariffs, restrictions met with restrictions. The article also touches on the idea of decoupling, right? Separating the economies.
It does. Given how massive and interconnected the two economies are, all that trade. China holding U.S. debt. The article suggests this economic reality underscores the futility of decoupling efforts. The implication seems to be that a full separation would be incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, certainly very damaging.
Perhaps one of the most interesting points in the CFR piece is about potential unintended consequences, especially for China's tech industry. What does it say there?
This is a really thought-provoking part of their analysis. The article observes that while U.S. actions, like export controls on specific technologies like advanced semiconductors, are meant to slow down competing Chinese industries,
They hinder their progress.
these very restrictions have accelerated Beijing's domestic technological innovation.
Accelerated it. So the restrictions aimed at hurrying them actually spurred them on. That seems counterintuitive.
It does seem that way. The article gives the example of a Chinese AI startup called DeepSeek, which launched a model in early 2025 that it claims competes with top U.S. models, but runs cheaper and more efficiently. The point the CFR analysis seems to make is that when China gets cut off from foreign tech, its response isn't just to lag behind. Instead, it appears to push harder to develop its own capabilities. And in some cases, maybe the pressure from the restrictions actually speeds up that domestic progress.
Wow, that's a really striking observation from that source, that a policy designed to create a disadvantage might, in fact, stimulate more self-reliance and even faster innovation elsewhere.
It definitely adds a significant layer of complexity, suggesting the outcomes of these trade actions aren't always simple or predictable.
Okay. We've really spent some time digging into the details from these three sources: the USTR report, the Wharton article, the CFR backgrounder. Let's try to pull it all together now. What's the collective picture they paint?
Well, synthesizing these views, you start with the USTR report laying out the clear government strategy. Actively use tariffs, use enforcement as core policy levers. The goal: rebuild domestic production, tackle what they see as unfair practices, reshape trade ties, especially with China.
Okay, that's the official plan and justification.
Then the Wharton article brings it down to earth. It shows how those policy actions hit the complex machinery of global commerce. Tariffs aren't just abstract tools. They're fundamental disruptions causing real uncertainty, hurting businesses, especially low-margin ones, forcing tough choices about inventory and capacity, and ultimately pushing costs toward consumers.
Right, the real-world friction.
And the CFR backgrounder provides that crucial context about the U.S.-China relationship itself. It confirms the trade war framing, the specific grievances like IP theft, the retaliation from China, but it also stresses just how deeply intertwined the economies are, making a clean break seem unlikely, according to their analysis. And critically, it highlights those complex, maybe unexpected outcomes, like U.S. restrictions potentially accelerating China's own tech development.
So putting it all together, these sources give us this multi-layered view. You have deliberate government policy aiming for specific outcomes, often framed around national interest and fairness. But these actions collide with the messy reality of global supply chains, creating tangible costs and challenges for businesses and people. And the interactions between major players like the US and China are so complex that the results aren't always what was intended, maybe even fostering the very capabilities the policy sought to restrain.
It really illustrates how trade policy doesn't happen in a vacuum. It interacts with a dynamic global system, and understanding the effects means looking at the official intent, the on-the-ground impacts, and the underlying relationships between nations.
And just to circle back to our mission, everything we've talked about, every insight, every statistic, every quote, comes directly and only from these three specific sources: the USTR report, the Wharton article, and the CFR backgrounder. We've really aimed to stay within the boundaries of this material for you.
Yeah, the goal was to distill these specific documents to give you, the listener, a solid, detailed understanding of what they say about U.S. trade wars, tariffs, and their impacts.
So thinking about everything we've unpacked from these sources, what are the key takeaways you'd pull out for our listeners?
Okay, boiling it down based purely on these three sources, I'd say. First, the USTR report makes it clear the U.S. government is deliberately using tools like tariffs and enforcement as central pillars of its trade policy, aiming to boost domestic production and directly challenge practices it views as unfair, with a strong focus on China and strategic industries.
Right, that's takeaway one: active, intentional policy using these tools.
Second, the Wharton analysis shows these policies have real, often difficult consequences for global supply chains. They create uncertainty, They cause operational headaches for businesses around costs and inventory, and these disruptions ultimately affect consumer prices. Tangible impacts.
Okay. And the third?
Third, the CFR perspective highlights that the U.S.-China trade relationship, despite the trade war label and genuine disputes over IP and market access, is incredibly interdependent. Attempts to force major changes through restrictions can have complex, sometimes surprising results. The example they give of potentially accelerating China's domestic tech innovation really underscores that complexity and the potential for unintended consequences.
That point about friction maybe speeding up innovation elsewhere is really something to chew on, isn't it? When you consider the stated U.S. goals, boosting domestic industry, countering unfair practices, and then you see these complex, maybe even contradictory effects described in the sources, like supply chain snarls or that potential innovation boost. What does that make you wonder about the future balance between global integration and national economic strategies? How might that dynamic, where trade friction potentially fuels localized innovation, reshape global commerce in ways we can't fully see yet?
It definitely raises big questions, doesn't it? The sources suggest the effects are layered, complex, and probably still playing out, not simple cause and effect.
Absolutely. It's clearly a space that requires ongoing attention and, well, deep dives like this one. Thank you so much for joining us as we explored these specific sources. We really hope this detailed look helps you feel well informed on this incredibly important and complex topic. We look forward to our next deep dive with you.